Welcome to Wednesday evening Bible study. We are currently on the move with Moses. I wound up in the series in a search for a fresh vision and a fresh passion from the Lord. I don't know about you, but COVID-19 has shifted my schedule and created challenges we've never faced before. And so I just began to sense that I needed a fresh vision and a fresh passion from the Lord. Over the last several weeks, I've been gleaming from others, and it just seemed at every turn, the resources I was reading and the people that I was talking to led me to the life of Moses. Somebody said to me, when Moses was 120 years old, his eyesight was not weak and his strength had not gone. So that got me to thinking about Moses and landed me in the book of Exodus and really an exploration of the life of Moses. And so I invite you to be on the move with Moses. Dwight L. Moody said about Moses, made this observation about his life, that you really could divide his life up into 4 40-year segments. In the first 40 years of his life, Moses spent thinking he was somebody. The second 40 years of his life, he learned he was a nobody. And the last 40 years of his life, he was discovering what God could do with a nobody. Now, the likelihood is you and I are not going to make it to 120. But the chances are that, I'm almost confident that we would find ourselves in one of those phases of our life, either thinking we're somebody, learning we're a nobody, or discovering what God can do with a nobody. I wonder where you're at. I've been thinking about where I'm at in that journey. Well, tonight in the book of Exodus, chapter 2, verses 11 through 15, we find Moses in the first phase of his life, those first 40 years, thinking he's a somebody. Verse 11 of chapter 2 tells us that he's all grown up, and it reads like this. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to see where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. So I want to concentrate on that little phrase for a moment. Moses had grown up, and I'm just convinced that Moses knew about his calling fairly early in his life to be used by God to deliver his people from bondage. And in this matter, that phrase, he's grown up, sort of describes his attitude, because he decides to sort of take matters into his own hands. So I have no doubt that he knows early, but the problem is, now this is his fight and not God's fight. He sees the struggle of his people and he says, hey, I got this. That's a problem. So you see, even when we know God has a plan for our life, but we take control of those plans ourselves, that's a problem. But now, I just confess to you, Moses is certainly well qualified for this job. If you look at earthly standards, I was kind of almost caught off guard by the description of Stephen before the Sanhedrin as he recounts the life of Moses. There was something in Acts chapter 7, particularly verse 21, that just caught me by surprise. I just had never seen it before. I know I've read it, but it just didn't jump off the page for me. Maybe see if it's like that for you. This is Acts chapter 7, verse 21. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Stephen tells us that Moses is 40. So if nothing else, life experience this guy ought to get it. You know, by the age of 40, we've learned a few things, hopefully. So in life experience, might be ready for a job like this. But then Stephen says, that he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So he's got a great education. But then there's this phrase that just jumped from the page for me, like, why did I? And it says this, and was powerful in speech and action. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. That's not what I remember. Because I have this flashback. It's in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10, where Moses is before God, and the fact that he doesn't speak very well is one of his excuses why God should find somebody else. I mean, here it is. It's Exodus 4:10. Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." What happened to this somebody? Stephen has such a different perspective. I mean, could it been in that early part of his life that Moses was well spoken, or at least thought he was? I mean, he sure steps up to the plate when the two Hebrews are fighting, and later when the Egyptian is fighting a Hebrew, and later when two Hebrews are fighting, he certainly isn't afraid to speak up. Now, 2 chapters later, I'm just not a very good speaker, Lord. You ought to find somebody else. Never really been good at that, so you ought to find somebody else. Just the fact that he confronts people seems to me to think at that stage of his life, he's pretty confident in himself. But then in chapter 4, he starts making excuses. Ever made excuses when God called you to do something? It is like we said last week. It's not like God doesn't know if we have weaknesses or frailties. He knows that before he calls us. But I wonder how this submission, this transformation that's happening in the life of Moses, ever how we discover that or define that between Stephen and Moses. I think this transition, it better prepares Moses to be a leader. Before, it was confidence, his own power and ability, powerful in his speech and actions. Now he realizes he desperately needs God to lead his people out of bondage. Now notice how God responds. If we stay in Exodus chapter 4, this time we go to verse 11. This is how God responds to his objection. The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" And then verse 12 says, "Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." I love what the Lord says to Moses. I will help you, and I will teach you what to say. Ooh, Lord. Do we ever need help there sometime of knowing what to say, right? And that's now what God says to Moses. And he's in a different place in his life. He is at a place of, early on, a somebody. And now he's realizing that he needs the Lord. Maybe we need the Lord in helping us know what to say. Well, let's go back. Exodus chapter 2, verse 12. The story continues. So if we go back, so here's where we found him. We kind of got off track for a second, but let's go back to where we were. So he finds an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews, his own people. And now we come back to this passage where where Moses picks up the story of this confrontation. Exodus chapter 2, verse 12. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" Sure seems to me that Moses has made a conscious decision to take matters into his own hands, doesn't it? I mean, sure appears that it's not a spur of the moment decision, because he takes precaution to look to the left and the right and see if anybody's looking. No question in my mind that he's seen that his people have been in trouble before. This is not his first rodeo. I think it's again the book of Acts that tells us there are about 75 of Jacob and his family that moved into Egypt, and now there's a couple of million of them probably. And so it would be hard to miss the hardship and the difficulty that his people was living under. So his reaction, as Chuck Swindoll pointed out in a summary of the life of Moses, was a reaction of the flesh. It was Moses. He looked to the left and the right, but his failure was he didn't look up. In our life and decision making, sometimes we find ourselves in the same predicament. We look at the earthly plane, like the things that are around us, and assess what dangers there might be or what decisions we might need to take into consideration. But Moses' failure, because it is God who called him, Moses' failure is that he didn't look up. What's really important for us in our life is we do that we look up and allow God to guide us in every decision that we make. So we find ourselves back in the book of Acts, chapter 7, this time verse 27, that gives us a little different perspective of this moment. I want you to hear, again, it's this self-reliance that Moses is walking through. This is Stephen's observation. But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside. And you see that? Pushed Moses aside. Who made you ruler over and judge over us? Who made you boss? It's this. And who put you in charge? Who do you think you are? Well, he thought he was somebody, apparently. Moses did. And there's what he said. Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had two sons. And then we go back to Exodus chapter 2, verse 14. Pardon the interruption. The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. So his sin has found him out. His effort to take matters into his own hands has gone wrong. So Moses attempts to hide his disobedience. That seems to happen, when we disobey God. There's usually a need when we react according to the flesh to carry out a cover-up. Now, apparently, Moses wasn't very good at the cover-up because it's the next day and people already know. Apparently, Moses didn't bear the Egyptian very deep. So we need to know that our sins will find us out. When we take matters in our own hands, when we leave God out of the plan, it always creates difficulty. So that brings me to our last little passage tonight. It's Exodus chapter 15, or chapter 2, verse 15, and it reads like this. When Pharaoh heard this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. So we can do the right thing the wrong way. What's important in our lesson today is to recognize this, that we can recognize God's plan for our life, and yet still, because he has granted us free will, we can choose to take matters into our own hands. Tonight, this afternoon, this evening, this morning, whenever you're watching this, I'm wondering what phase of life you're in. Have we left God out of the picture? It's a wonderful thing when we discover what God can do with a nobody.